On a bitterly cold Sunday night in December 1989, a 5-year-old girl vanished from the middle of a Christmas party while nearly 100 people stood only steps away. It was just after 10 p.m. Inside a suburban apartment clubhouse in Northern Virginia, Melissa Brannen had been inside the room moments earlier, asking for one last plate of potato chips. Then, she was no longer there. What was discovered in the minutes that followed would force investigators to listen to what a child could not say. Someone said her name again, this time louder, letting it stretch across the length of the clubhouse as if volume alone could pull a child back into view. Tammy Brannen turned slowly, scanning faces, tables, doorways, the snack area where paper plates and half-empty bowls were still scattered. For a moment, she expected to see Melissa crouched low behind a chair or standing on tiptoe near the counter, waiting to be noticed. The room was warm, thick with the smell of food and wool coats damp from the cold outside, and it felt impossible that a child could simply not be there. "Has anyone seen Melissa?" Tammy asked, her voice steady but sharpened by urgency, one hand already gripping the strap of her purse. Melissa had been here all evening. Melissa Lee Brannen was 5 years old, an age where personality arrived faster than caution. She talked easily, sang without fear, and moved through rooms with the unearned confidence of a child who had never learned that attention could be dangerous. That evening, she had been exactly what she always was, bright, affectionate, and restless in a way that made stillness feel unnatural to her. She lived alone with her mother, Tammy, in Northern Virginia, their life shaped by routines built for two. Mornings were shared and unhurried, evenings close and predictable, the kind of intimacy that grows when a child and a parent become each other's primary world. Melissa knew where her mother was at all times, and Tammy, in turn, could sense her daughter's presence without looking, the way parents often can. At the Christmas party, Melissa stayed close at first, pressing against Tammy's side, tugging gently at her coat, asking when they would leave and whether she could have another snack. She wore her favorite sweater beneath her coat, a navy blue one with a bright yellow big bird stitched across the front, chosen not for warmth but because it made her feel seen. The character mattered to her. It made people smile when they looked at her, and she liked that. The clubhouse was full, but it did not feel crowded in a threatening way. Families knew one another. Children ran freely between adults, slipping in and out of conversations, stepping over coats piled against the wall. The room smelled of food and artificial pine, of paper plates and damp winter jackets, the air warm enough that windows fogged slightly along the edges. Earlier, Melissa had stood in front of a small cluster of people and sung "Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer," her voice thin but confident, her eyes scanning faces to see who was listening. She forgot a line and laughed at herself, then kept going anyway. Applause followed, soft and indulgent, and she soaked it in without embarrassment, stepping back to her mother with a satisfied grin. Tammy smiled and smoothed Melissa's hair, feeling the familiar texture beneath her fingers. She had been wearing her rabbit fur coat that night, something warm and distinctive, brushing against Melissa's sweater when her daughter leaned in close. It was a small, unremarkable contact, the kind that happened dozens of times a day without meaning anything beyond comfort. As the evening wore on, Melissa grew more animated rather than tired. She moved between the snack table and the center of the room, collecting potato chips, showing them to other children, narrating small, unimportant things with seriousness. She knew the space. She felt at home inside it. The adults talked about work, about school schedules, about the weather turning colder. Laughter rose and fell naturally. Coats were pulled on and adjusted, and goodbyes began to stack up in no particular order. It felt like the ending of something ordinary, not the edge of anything else. Melissa asked for one last plate of chips, her voice casual, already half-turned toward the table as if permission were assumed. Tammy nodded, distracted by conversation, trusting the distance between them without thinking about it. The room was still full. The night still felt safe. Nothing in that moment announced itself as fragile. There was only the quiet sense of routine continuing, of a child existing exactly where she belonged, wrapped in familiarity, surrounded by people who recognized her face and her voice. If there was any shift at all, it lived below awareness, a faint tightening in the air, a pause between movements that meant nothing yet. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, the Christmas party at the Woodside Apartments clubhouse began to dissolve in small, ordinary ways. Parents reached for coats. Children were gathered, counted, then counted again. Chairs scraped across the floor as volunteers began folding them along the walls. The music had been turned down, replaced by overlapping conversations and the dull thump of footsteps moving toward the exits. Melissa Brannen was still inside the clubhouse. She stood near the snack table, balancing a paper plate in both hands. Potato chips slid toward one edge as she shifted her weight, the smell of grease and salt clinging faintly to her fingers. Her winter coat was open, revealing the navy blue sweater with the bright yellow big bird stitched across the front. The character's face stretched slightly as she moved. Tammy Brannen was several steps away, turned partly toward another parent. Her attention divided between the conversation and the routine act of preparing to leave. She could still see her daughter. Nothing about the distance felt unsafe. Melissa glanced toward her mother, then back at the table. She picked up one more chip and chewed slowly, watching people move past her. Children brushed by, some running, some dragging tired feet. The room felt crowded but familiar. Across the clubhouse, Caleb Hughes watched the movement settle into patterns. He was 23 years old, employed by the apartment complex as a groundskeeper and handyman, and he had been present at the party for most of the evening. Earlier, several women had noticed his behavior, his voice too loud, his comments inappropriate, his proximity uncomfortable, but at this moment, he stood quietly near the side of the room, hands at his sides, eyes tracking rather than wandering. He noticed Melissa when she shifted away from the center of the room. The movement was subtle. As people collected coats and said their goodbyes, small gaps opened near the edges of the clubhouse. Melissa stepped into one of those gaps without thinking, adjusting the plate against her hip as someone passed too close behind her. "Oops," she said reflexively, steadying herself. Caleb took 2 steps forward. "You want help?" he asked, nodding toward the plate. Melissa looked up at him. He was a familiar face in the complex, someone she may have seen before without ever learning his name. She shook her head. "I'm okay," she said, tightening her grip. "All right," he replied easily, stepping back as if the exchange meant nothing. Melissa turned, intending to walk back toward where she believed her mother was standing. But the room had shifted again. The adults she expected to see were no longer in the same positions, and the open space she remembered was now filled with coats and bodies moving toward the door. She stopped near the short hallway that led toward the restrooms and storage area, pausing to orient herself. The lighting there was dimmer, the noise softer, the smell different cleaning solution instead of food. Caleb appeared beside her again, this time closer than before. "There's another table back there," he said, gesturing down the hallway. Less crowded. Melissa followed the direction of his hand. The hallway was empty at that moment. She hesitated, frowning slightly, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I don't," she began. "It's right there," Caleb said, already stepping away, his tone casual, as if assuming compliance rather than demanding it. Melissa took a step after him. The sounds of the party faded almost immediately as they moved farther from the main room. The hum of the building's heating system replaced laughter and conversation. Her boots tapped softly against the linoleum floor, the plate rattling faintly as she walked. They reached the end of the hallway, where a utility door stood unlocked. Cold air leaked in through the gap around the frame, sharp and sudden. Melissa felt it instantly against her cheeks and hands. She stopped. "It's cold," she said, pulling her coat closer. Caleb turned toward her. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to register. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked once toward the hallway behind them. "Just for a second," he said. "We're stepping out." Before Melissa could respond, the restroom door behind them opened. An adult exited, brushing past without looking closely at either of them. The interruption lasted no more than a second, but it broke the moment just long enough for Caleb to act. He grabbed Melissa's arm. The grip was firm, precise, not wild. He pulled her forward through the utility door, which swung open wider without resistance. The temperature outside was bitter, the cold immediate and punishing as it cut through her clothing. Melissa cried out, the plate slipping from her hands as it hit the ground inside, chips scattering across the floor. "Stop," she said, her voice rising, panic breaking through. Caleb did not answer. He moved quickly now, guiding her across the short distance toward a large window that had been cranked open from the outside. The opening was wide enough for an adult to pass through, wide enough for what he intended. Melissa struggled, boots scraping against the concrete, her body twisting instinctively away from him. Her coat snagged briefly against the edge of the window frame as he lifted her, fabric bunching beneath his hands. Inside the clubhouse, voices continued. Someone laughed. A chair fell over and was righted again. Outside, Caleb pushed her through the opening. The motion was fast, practiced. He followed immediately, landing on the other side and pulling her with him. Within seconds, they were moving away from the building, swallowed by darkness and distance. Back inside, Tammy Brannen finished adjusting her coat and turned fully toward the snack table. Melissa was no longer there. Tammy scanned the room once, then again, her eyes moving faster than before. She took a step forward, heart beginning to race, a cold weight settling low in her stomach. "Melissa?" she called. No answer came back. And in that exact moment, before doors were checked, before windows were noticed, before anyone understood the significance of what had been left behind, Melissa Brannen was already gone from the place where nearly 100 people believed she had been safe. The shift from confusion to urgency happened fast, and it happened without ceremony. Within minutes of Tammy calling Melissa's name for the second time, people stopped packing up and started looking deliberately. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Parents checked behind folding tables, under chairs, inside the restrooms. Someone opened a storage closet and flicked on the light, peering inside as if a child might have curled up there unnoticed. Tammy moved through the room with purpose now, her eyes scanning instead of searching, her body already bracing for answers she did not want. She checked the snack table again, then the hallway, then the door leading outside, stepping into the cold without hesitation. The temperature hit her like a slap, the night air sharp enough to sting her lungs as she called out again. "Melissa." The parking area was mostly empty. A few cars idled as families prepared to leave, exhaust rising in pale clouds. No small figure appeared between the buildings. No voice answered back. Inside, someone said, "Maybe she went to the bathroom," though the suggestion sounded less confident than it should have. Another parent shook their head slowly, already unconvinced. It was at this point that someone noticed the utility door. It stood ajar, letting in a thin stream of cold air that cut across the floor. A volunteer walked toward it and pushed it open wider, peering outside. The night beyond looked empty, ordinary, wrong only in its silence. Then someone else noticed the window. It was larger than the others, cranked open farther than necessary, wide enough that it no longer made sense as ventilation. People gathered around it instinctively, staring at the opening as if it might explain itself. No one touched it yet. No one said what they were thinking. Tammy stood frozen, eyes locked on the window frame, her mind racing through possibilities without landing on any of them. "This doesn't make sense," she said quietly. The call to the police went out shortly after, urgency sharpening every word. When officers arrived, the atmosphere inside the clubhouse changed again. The space was no longer communal. It became procedural. Officers moved people away from the door and window, marking off areas, asking everyone to remain where they were. Names were taken. Questions were asked, first broadly, then more specifically. When did you last see her? Who was she with? Did anyone leave around that time? Timelines began to form, fragile and incomplete. It was established quickly that Melissa had last been seen near the snack area around 10 o'clock. Within 3 to 5 minutes, she was gone. The speed of it shifted the investigation immediately from a missing child scenario to a suspected non-family abduction. By midnight, volunteers had gathered outside the complex, flashlights cutting through the dark as search teams spread outward in widening circles. The temperature continued to drop, the cold biting through gloves and jackets, making fingers numb and breath visible. Officers coordinated with residents, knocking on doors, checking dumpsters, scanning tree lines and paths between buildings. Melissa did not appear. As the search expanded, investigators began focusing inward on the people who had been inside the clubhouse that night. Witnesses described a young man who had made them uncomfortable earlier in the evening. A groundskeeper, a handyman, someone who worked on the property and knew the layout well. His name was Caleb Hughes. Descriptions of his behavior came in quickly once his name was mentioned. Several women reported that he had made crude sexual comments throughout the party, comments that had drawn uneasy laughter or sharp rebukes. More troubling were the accounts that he had spent an unusual amount of time watching the children, his attention lingering rather than passing. More than one person recalled seeing him near Melissa. Officers went to Hughes's residence shortly after the initial report, but he was not home. His wife, Carol Hughes, answered the door. She appeared cooperative, answering questions calmly, stating that her husband was not with her at the time. When Hughes arrived home at approximately 12:20 a.m., his behavior immediately stood out. According to Carol, he did not sit down. He did not ask what was happening at the apartment complex. Instead, he went straight to the washing machine. He removed his clothes, his shirt, pants, shoes, belt, and a knife sheath, and placed them all inside. The washing machine started almost immediately. The dryer followed soon after. Carol later recalled hearing the dryer running late into the night, an unusual detail that stuck with her because it did not fit the pattern of an ordinary evening return. When officers returned and spoke with Hughes directly, they noted his demeanor. He was calm, controlled, almost flat. He answered questions without volunteering information. He denied involvement and offered a simple explanation for his movements that night. Investigators did not challenge him directly yet. Not then. Attention turned to his vehicle, a red Honda Civic. The car was searched carefully. Officers photographed the interior, vacuumed the seats, and documented every item inside. The passenger seat became a focal point almost immediately. The odometer told a story that did not align with Hughes's account of his evening. He claimed to have driven approximately 10 miles. The odometer indicated 51. When asked about the discrepancy, Hughes suggested he had taken a longer route to buy beer. Investigators noted the explanation without comment, but the timeline did not support it. Liquor stores in the area had been closed by the time he claimed to be shopping. Another detail emerged during the examination of his clothing and shoes. The sides of the soles on his sneakers had been cut away. The modification was precise, deliberate. Investigators hypothesized that the cuts were intended to remove trace evidence, soil, blood, or other material that might link the shoes to a specific outdoor location. Meanwhile, the search for Melissa continued relentlessly. Volunteers combed nearby woods. Police dogs were brought in, noses to the ground, tracing paths that led nowhere. Helicopters scanned from above, their lights sweeping across the landscape in wide arcs. Every possible place a child could wander was checked and checked again. Nothing was found. By morning, exhaustion set in. The cold had taken its toll on searchers, and the reality of the situation pressed down heavily. Melissa had vanished in minutes, from inside a building full of people, and had left nothing behind that could tell them where she was. Tammy remained at the center of it all, answering questions, repeating timelines, clinging to routine details as if they might anchor her. She described what Melissa was wearing, what she had eaten, what she had said. Each detail felt suddenly monumental, as though precision itself could summon her daughter back. As daylight broke, investigators reassessed. There were no signs of an accident, no evidence that Melissa had wandered away on her own, no indication that a family member was involved. The unlocked door and open window suggested planning, not chance, and one man stood out among the rest. Caleb Hughes had opportunity. He had access. He had behavior that multiple witnesses found troubling, and he had acted in ways that suggested urgency after the fact, washing clothes, altering shoes, driving far beyond his stated route. The case narrowed, not to certainty, but to focus. By the end of the first 48 hours, the search shifted again from looking for a lost child to building a case around a suspect who had left behind only fragments. And those fragments, investigators understood, would have to speak louder than a body ever could. Time did not move forward so much as it spread out. Days turned into weeks, then into months, without bringing anything new back to the surface. The initial urgency that had fueled the first searches gave way to something heavier and quieter, a persistence that required more discipline than adrenaline. Patrol cars no longer lined the streets at night. Helicopters no longer swept the area with light. What remained was paperwork, follow-ups, and the slow narrowing of possibility. The case did not disappear, but it changed shape. Investigators continued to re-interview witnesses from the Christmas party, sitting them down one by one in offices that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Each person was asked the same questions again, not because answers were expected to change, but because inconsistencies often revealed themselves only with repetition. Who stood where? Who left early? Who lingered? Who spoke to whom? The answers varied in detail, but not in outcome. Everyone remembered the noise, the crowd, the way the evening felt normal until it suddenly did not. No one remembered seeing Melissa leave the building. No one remembered hearing anything that stood out sharply enough to act on in the moment. Caleb Hughes remained at the center of the investigation, though the case against him was not yet solid enough to speak out loud with certainty. Detectives reviewed his movements carefully, reconstructing his night mile by mile. The discrepancy in his odometer readings remained unresolved. 51 miles could not be explained away by a short trip to buy beer, especially not when the stores were already closed. The explanation hung in the air during interviews, never fully addressed, never convincingly dismissed. Hughes maintained his composure. He answered questions without anger, without visible anxiety, without volunteering information that was not specifically asked of him. When confronted with the washing machine and dryer running late that night, he shrugged it off as routine. When asked about his shoes, he offered no explanation that could be verified, only vague statements about wear and tear. Investigators noted everything. Without a body, every fragment mattered. The absence of Melissa began to change how people spoke about her. Her name still circulated, but now it was often followed by silence, by glances exchanged between adults who did not know what to say anymore. Posters remained taped to windows and telephone poles, their edges curling in the cold, her face slowly becoming part of the landscape rather than a disruption of it. For Tammy Brannen, time behaved differently. She woke each morning with the same immediate thought, the same reflexive reach toward an empty space. Her days filled with appointments, phone calls, meetings with investigators, but none of it softened the constant pressure beneath her chest. She replayed small details over and over: what Melissa had been wearing, how her hair had been brushed that morning, the sound of her voice singing earlier that evening, not because she believed it would change anything, but because letting go felt like a betrayal. She refused to change her routines more than necessary. Tammy kept her last name visible. She kept her phone number listed publicly. She told friends, quietly but firmly, that if Melissa were somehow alive, she needed to be able to find her way home without obstacles. Investigators understood the weight of this kind of hope. They did not discourage it. They simply continued their work. In the background, another cruel distraction emerged. Two men, completely unconnected to Melissa or Caleb Hughes, attempted to exploit the situation. They contacted the Brannen family and demanded $75,000, promising Melissa's safe return. The message sent a shock through the investigation, forcing officers to divide their attention between a potential lead and a possible manipulation. A sting operation followed. The men were arrested while attempting to collect the money. Their claims collapsed under scrutiny, revealing nothing but opportunism and cruelty. They were sentenced to prison 7 years for one, 3 for the other, but the damage lingered. The false hope they had introduced left behind a deeper exhaustion, a sharper awareness of how vulnerable grief made people. The search for Melissa continued regardless. In 1995, nearly 6 years after the disappearance, a worker for a local power company found a fragment of red cloth in a lake near Lorton. The detail mattered immediately. Melissa had been wearing red tights the night she vanished. The lake was drained. Divers searched the muddy bottom methodically, working in cold, murky water that swallowed sound and light. Investigators watched from the shore, tension building with each hour that passed without discovery. When the search ended, no human remains were found. The cloth fragment was eventually determined to be unrelated. Another door closed. As the years stretched on, the case settled into a new category: unresolved, but not forgotten. Detectives rotated in and out as assignments changed, but the file remained active, thick with reports, photographs, and evidence logs. Advances in forensic science were noted, discussed, sometimes tested against the material already collected, though limitations remained. Not every question could be answered yet. Not every trace could speak. Melissa's image continued to appear in local media, especially during the holidays. Footage of her singing resurfaced year after year, a reminder that her absence was not abstract. It had a voice. It had a face. Tammy watched those broadcasts when she could bear to. When she could not, She turned the television off and focused on the work she had begun doing quietly alongside other families of missing children. Helping them did not ease her pain, but it gave it direction. It allowed her to exist in a world where loss was understood without explanation. Meanwhile, investigators kept circling back to the same conclusion. Melissa had not wandered away. She had not been taken by a stranger passing through. The circumstances, the speed, the access, the familiarity with the building pointed inward. Someone who knew the space, someone who knew how to move through it unnoticed, someone who had left behind fibers, hairs, and unanswered miles on an odometer. Those fragments sat waiting, preserved carefully, labeled and catalogued, until science caught up with the silence. And when it did, the case would change again. The evidence had been waiting. It sat sealed in bags and envelopes, labeled with dates and initials, stored under fluorescent lights that never turned off. While time outside moved forward, years accumulating, faces aging, memories dulling the fibers, hairs, and mechanical records remained unchanged, suspended in a moment that science was only beginning to understand. The breakthrough did not arrive as a single revelation. It came in layers. Investigators returned to the red Honda Civic first, not because it was new, but because it had never been exhausted. The vehicle had been processed carefully in the early days, vacuumed seat by seat, surface by surface, with particular attention paid to the passenger side. Now, with advances in trace analysis and a clearer theory of the crime, those vacuumed samples were re-examined with fresh intent. Under magnification, fibers began to separate themselves from the background. Blue and yellow strands appeared among the debris, thin but consistent, their color holding steady under the microscope. Analysts compared them side by side with fibers taken from an identical navy blue sweater purchased from the same JCPenney store where Tammy Brannen had bought Melissa's clothing. The match was precise. The fibers shared the same dye composition, the same acrylic structure, the same twist pattern. Individually, each similarity meant little. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The location of the fibers mattered as much as their identity. They were concentrated on the passenger seat. This detail shifted the analysis from possibility to implication. Melissa had been wearing a winter coat over the Big Bird sweater when she disappeared, yet no fibers from the coat were present in the vehicle. The sweater fibers, which sat beneath the coat, had transferred directly to the seat. The only reasonable explanation was removal. Someone had taken off her coat while she was inside the car. There was no innocent scenario that accounted for this action. A stranger had no practical reason to remove a child's winter coat unless there was intent that went beyond transportation. Investigators understood this immediately, and so did prosecutors. The charge that would eventually be brought abduction with intent to defile began to take shape here, grounded not in speculation, but in fiber. Then came the rabbit hairs. Tammy Brannen owned a coat made of rabbit fur, a rare and distinctive material. Earlier that evening, Melissa had leaned against her mother repeatedly, her sweater brushing against the fur as they stood together inside the clubhouse. That contact transferred microscopic rabbit hairs onto Melissa's clothing, an unremarkable exchange at the time. Those same rabbit hairs were now present in the passenger seat of Caleb Hughes's car. This created a secondary transfer chain that investigators recognized immediately. The fibers had moved from Tammy to Melissa, and from Melissa to the car. The probability of that sequence occurring without direct contact between the child and the vehicle was vanishingly small. Piece by piece, the narrative tightened. Red wool and synthetic fibers were also recovered, consistent with Melissa's plaid skirt. Each element reinforced the same conclusion. Melissa had been inside the passenger seat of Hughes's vehicle. The case no longer relied on inference alone. It had physical anchors, yet one element remained contentious. In the back of Hughes's car, investigators had found paper tissues bearing stains that initially appeared to be blood. The samples were sent to the FBI laboratory, where they were examined by Joseph Grispino, a serology specialist. Using traditional blood typing methods, Grispino concluded that Melissa Brannen could not be excluded as the source. The language mattered. Could not be excluded was not a confirmation, but it was suggestive. It implied possibility without certainty, and in a case built on fragments, that possibility carried weight. At the same time, another examiner at the FBI laboratory, Dwight Adams, was conducting more advanced DNA testing on the same samples. His conclusion was unequivocal. The blood was not Melissa's. This discrepancy created a fault line inside the laboratory. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Robert Horan, faced a decision. The serology results appeared more incriminating, even if they were less specific. The DNA results were more precise, but they undercut a potentially powerful piece of evidence. At trial, Horan emphasized the serology findings while downplaying the DNA analysis. The choice sparked internal outrage. Within the FBI laboratory, examiners questioned how two units could produce conflicting interpretations without resolution. An investigation by the Office of the Inspector General later found no evidence that Grispino had been pressured to slant his findings. However, it did identify a catastrophic breakdown in communication between the serology and DNA units. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. The Brannen case became a turning point in forensic science, not because of what was found, but because of how it was handled. The FBI merged its serology and DNA units into a single entity, ensuring that no preliminary results could be issued before all available testing was complete. New reporting protocols were established, prioritizing accuracy over prosecutorial advantage. Peer review became mandatory. Melissa Brannen's case had exposed a vulnerability in the system, and the system changed in response. In the courtroom, the focus remained on the fibers. Witnesses testified about Hughes's behavior at the Christmas party, his crude sexual comments, his fixation on children, his proximity to Melissa. The jury heard about the odometer discrepancy, the 51 miles driven against a claimed 10. They heard about the washing machine and dryer running in the early hours of the morning, about the cut soles of his shoes. Hughes sat expressionless throughout. When his defense team attempted to explain the odometer reading by claiming he had driven a scenic route to buy beer, the explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Liquor stores had been closed by the time he claimed to be shopping. The route made no sense. The miles had nowhere to go. On March 8, 1991, the verdict was delivered. Caleb Daniel Hughes was found guilty of abduction with intent to defile and sentenced to 50 years in prison. There was no body to bury, no location to mark, no final confirmation of what had happened after the abduction. The conviction closed a legal loop, but it did not resolve the case in any human sense. For investigators, the outcome was both satisfying and incomplete. They had proven that a child could be taken, harmed, and convicted without ever being found. They had demonstrated the power of trace evidence, of fibers and hairs that spoke when witnesses could not. But they had also confronted the limits of their reach. Melissa Brannen remained missing. The case file did not close. It thickened. Search efforts continued sporadically over the years. In 1995, a fragment of red cloth discovered in a nearby lake reignited hope briefly, only to extinguish it again when searches yielded nothing. Advances in technology prompted periodic reviews, each time raising the same quiet question: could science now do what it could not before? For Tammy Brannen, the conviction did not deliver closure. It delivered a certainty of guilt without the mercy of answers. She continued to live with the absence, transforming it into action by volunteering with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, helping other families navigate the same endless waiting. Decades later, the case would shift once more. In August 2019, under Virginia's parole laws, as they existed at the time of sentencing, Caleb Hughes was released after serving nearly 30 years. The news reopened wounds that had never healed, not just for the Brannen family, but for the community that remembered. Hughes did not admit guilt. He did not disclose the location of Melissa's body. Instead, he disappeared into a new life, one that would reveal, with chilling clarity, that the patterns identified decades earlier had not faded, and that realization would lead directly to his return to prison. The verdict did not end the case. It only changed the shape of what remained. Caleb Hughes was led away from the courtroom to begin a 50-year sentence, and for a brief moment, the machinery of justice appeared to have done its job. The state had proven its case without a body. A jury had listened to fibers, to mileage, to behavior, and had reached a conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. On paper, the system held. In life, nothing closed. Melissa Brannen did not come home. There was no location disclosed, no final account of what had happened after she was taken from the clubhouse. The questions that mattered most, the where and the how, remained unanswered. sealed behind a silence Hughes never broke. For Tammy Brannen, the conviction marked neither relief nor resolution. It marked permanence. She returned to a life where every milestone arrived without her daughter. Birthdays passed uncelebrated. Holidays came and went with an absence that no sentence length could fill. Yet Tammy refused to allow the case to fossilize into memory alone. She kept her last name visible in public records, kept her phone number unchanged, quietly maintaining a path home in case Melissa were ever able to find it. Her grief did not recede. It reorganized. Tammy became a volunteer with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, using her experience to guide other parents through the first hours, the first weeks, the long years that followed a disappearance. She learned how to speak to families whose lives had split into before and after, and she did so without offering false hope or rehearsed consolation. Her presence carried credibility that could not be taught. Meanwhile, the case itself began to ripple outward. Inside forensic science, the Brannen investigation became a reference point, cited in training materials and academic discussions as an example of both innovation and failure. The fiber evidence was praised for its precision and impact, while the internal conflict at the FBI laboratory served as a warning. From that fracture came reform-merged units, stricter protocols, and an emphasis on accuracy over convenience. Melissa's absence had altered how evidence was handled nationwide. Yet for all the institutional change, the central truth remained unchanged. The homicide was unsolved. Fairfax County continued to classify the case that way, reviewing it periodically as technology advanced, re-examining items that had once reached the limits of available science. Detectives spoke carefully when asked about it, acknowledging both the strength of the conviction and the absence that haunted it. In August 2019, the case reopened in a way no one expected. Under Virginia's parole laws as they existed at the time of sentencing, Caleb Hughes was released after serving 29 years and 7 months, just over half of his original sentence. The announcement landed heavily in the community. There had been no confession, no disclosure, no cooperation. And now, the man convicted of abducting a 5-year-old child was free. Hughes did not return quietly. He relocated to Central Virginia and began presenting himself under a constructed identity, telling neighbors and coworkers that he was a widower and a military veteran. The story earned him sympathy and trust. He embedded himself into ordinary routines, offering help, volunteering information, recreating the same access points he had once exploited. Most disturbingly, he offered to babysit. Families accepted. For several months, Hughes cared for a 5-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy without supervision, directly violating the conditions of his parole, which prohibited any contact with minors. No alarm was raised until a coworker, uneasy with inconsistencies in Hughes's story, searched the Virginia Sex Offender Registry. The truth surfaced immediately. Parole officers moved quickly. In May 2024, Hughes was arrested again, not for a new assault, but for violating the explicit terms designed to prevent precisely this situation. He was returned to prison, where he will now remain until at least 2039. For many, the rearrest confirmed what had always been feared, that the passage of time had not altered Hughes's patterns, only paused them. For the Brannen family, it reinforced a deeper injustice that even a conviction did not guarantee safety, and that systems built to manage risk could still fail the vulnerable. Today, Melissa Brannen's case remains open. Detectives continue to review evidence using emerging technologies, exploring the possibility that touch DNA or advanced extraction methods might yet reveal something new. The hope is quieter now, more measured, but it has not disappeared. What remains most enduring is not the crime itself, but its lessons. The case proved that absence does not erase accountability, that fibers, hairs, and small transfers can carry truth across decades, that institutions can change, but only after harm exposes their weaknesses, and that justice, when incomplete, leaves behind responsibilities rather than closure. Melissa was 5 years old. She was warm inside a crowded room. She was close enough to be seen. Her story endures not because of how she was taken, but because of what was built in response to her absence, and because silence, when examined closely enough, can still speak. What do you think happened to Melissa Lee Brannen after she was taken from that room? Do you believe the full truth has ever been told? Do you think the justice system did enough not just to convict, but to protect? And how does it sit with you knowing that someone convicted in this case was later able to move freely among children again? Share your thoughts in the comments. Not theories for shock, but reflections, questions, concerns. These conversations matter more than silence. If you have information about Melissa's disappearance, contact the Fairfax County Police Department. Even the smallest detail can still matter. And if you believe stories like this deserve time, care, and depth, if you want narratives that follow evidence, center victims, and challenge comfortable conclusions, subscribe to this channel. New long-form true crime investigations are released regularly.